Hello. We're somewhere in chapter 3. I'm going to start with learning to handle conflict in relationships. One caveat for recovering the ability to authentically be yourself is that it is unreasonable and unfair to expect anyone to accept you if you are being abusively angry or contemptuous. Some trauma survivors flash back into this type of behavior by acting out from their outer critic. If this is an issue for you, Chapter 10 provides guidance for deconstructing this intimacy-destroying habit. In this vein, it is important to note that intimacy does not mean unconditional love. As John Gottman's scholarly research shows, a certain amount of disagreement, disaffection, and disappointment is normal in a relationship. The hallmark of successful couples is their ability to handle feelings of anger and hurt in a constructive and civil way. Gottman's studies have identified this as a key characteristic of couples who still really like each other after 10 years. Tools for lovingly resolving conflict. Toolbox 4 in Chapter 16 is a pragmatic list of techniques and perspectives to help couples resolve disruptions in their mutual attunement. Moreover, books by the Gottmans and Sue Johnson provide a great and practical help. I also find that Beyond the Marriage Fantasy by Dan Beaver is especially helpful for men. Reparenting. Reparenting is a key aspect of relational healing. It is primarily a process of addressing the many developmentally arrested needs of the traumatized child that we were. In this book, we repeatedly address the two most fundamental of these needs, love and protection. Suggested intentions for recovery. Toolbox 1 in Chapter 16 renders yet another picture of the diverse developmental arrests that may as yet be unaddressed in the CPTSD survivor. The toolbox presents these needs as tangible goals that we can use to direct our recovery efforts. Self-mothering and self-fathering. An important yin-yang dynamic of reparenting involves balancing self-mothering and self-fathering. When a child's mothering needs are adequately met, self-compassion is installed at the core of her being. When the same is true of her fathering needs, self-protection also becomes deeply embedded. Self-compassion is the domicile of recovery, and self-protection is its foundation. When self-compassion is sufficiently established as a home base to return to in difficult times, an urge to be self-protective naturally arises from it. Living in the world without access to these primal instincts of survival is truly terrifying. We advance our recovery process immeasurably when we commit to remothering and refathering ourselves. I encourage you now to commit to becoming an unshakable source of compassion and protection for yourself. Self-mothering grows self-compassion. The most essential task of self-mothering is building a deeply felt sense that we are lovable and deserve to be loved. Self-mothering is the practice of loving and accepting the inner child in all phases of his emotional, mental, and physical experience. If inner child is a problematic concept for any reason, you can imagine nurturing the developmental arrested part of yourself. Self-mothering is based on the precept that unconditional love is every child's birthright. Recovering from the loss of unconditional love is problematic. Not getting enough of it as children was the greatest loss we had. Sadly, this loss can never be completely remediated, because unconditional love is only appropriate and developmentally helpful during the first 2 years or so of life. After this time, the toddler has to begin to learn that human love comes with some conditions. Although love still needs to be copious at this time, the child must be gently shown that behaviors like hitting, biting, and breaking things are not acceptable. The period of unconditional love has begun and is successfully guided via a very gradual increase in learning about necessary and healthy limits and rules. The toddler who receives good enough parenting learns relatively easy to survive the gradual diminishing supply of unconditional love. During this time, she learns little by little that other people also have rights and needs. Her absolute entitlement to gratification is coming to an end, and the needs of her parents will not always be forfeited to accommodate her. Once again, psychological health is based on having about 2 years of this no-question-asked entitlement to unconditional love. It's really beautiful remembering Jordan's first 2 years. I love my son. It is the normal, healthy narcissism that Freud described as his majesty the baby. Serious problems accrue, however, when the toddler does not begin to learn that there are limits to his original entitlement. If there are no limits for too long, then the journey toward adult narcissism begins. On the other hand, if there are too many limits too soon, the matrix of trauma begins to form. Enlightened parents introduce limits slowly but surely. They do it at such a rate that by the time the child reaches adolescence, he can balance satisfying his needs with helping his intimates to satisfy theirs. He learns to be sharing and reciprocal, a developmental task that is essential to keeping intimacy alive in his life. CPTSD is a syndrome of the dearth of unconditional love, or what the great therapist Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard. CPTSD can also occur when unconditional love is shut off in an all-or-nothing way in early childhood. Some parents can shower love on babies, but as soon as the child begins toddling around and expressing a will of her own, they become severely punishing and rejecting. The limits of unconditional love. The terrible absence of love, or its abrupt, premature termination, is extremely painful, and its loss is very difficult to address. We cannot help desperately wanting the unconditional love we were so unfairly deprived of, but we cannot, as adults, expect others to supply our unmet early entitlement needs. The one expectation to this is therapy, but that, of course, is usually only 1 or 2 hours a week. Miraculously, I have seen the unconditional positive regard of the therapist be enough on numerous occasions to significantly repair the damage of not being parentally loved. And when it is enough, the therapist's consistent caring facilities, the awakening of a developmentally arrested need to hold yourself with enough unconditional love. We survivors often struggle with managing our understandable but unrealistic yearning to receive permanent unconditional love from a parent, partner, or friend. Like the toddler, we eventually have to accept the limits of adult love. This is especially true in romance, where the intoxication of an unconditional love rarely lasts for more than a year. Around this time, partners inevitably begin to feel more frustration with each other because of differences in their individual needs. Nonetheless, romantic love can be a significant source of therapeutic unconditional-like love, especially when it survives the inevitability of some disappointment. Susan Campbell's A Couple's Journey is a pragmatic, research-based book on how to reap more intimacy out of normal relationship disappointments. Inner child work. Let us return to the concept of self-mothering. As mother to ourselves, we commit to increasing our self-compassion and unconditional positive regard. Self-mothering is a resolute refusal to indulge in self-hatred and self-abandonment. It proceeds from the realization that self-punishment is counterproductive. It is enhanced by the understanding that patience and self-encouragement are more effective than self-judgment and self-rejection in achieving recovery. You can enhance your self-mothering skills by imaginatively creating a safe space in your heart where your inner child and your present-time self are always welcome. Consistent tenderness towards yourself welcomes the child into the adult body you now inhabit, and shows him that it is now a nurturing place protected by a warm and powerful adult. Self-mothering can be enhanced by thought-correcting critics' negative messages with healing words that the child is in all likelihood never heard from his parents. A of mine once shared a pearl of wisdom with me. Thoughts, just mere thoughts, are as powerful as electric batteries, as good for you as sunlight is, or as bad for you as poison is. Here, then, are some useful messages for nurturing the growth of your self-compassion and self-esteem. I recommend that you imagine speaking them to your inner child, especially when you are suffering with a flashback. Reparenting affirmations. I'm so glad you were born. You are a good person. I love who you are and am doing my best to always be on your side. You can come to me whenever you're feeling hurt or bad. You do not have to be perfect to get my love and protection. All of your feelings are okay with me. I'm always glad to see you. It is okay for you to be angry, and I won't let you hurt yourself or others when you are. You can make mistakes. They are your teachers. You can know what you need and ask for help. You can have your own preferences and tastes. You are a delight to my eyes. You can choose your own values. You can pick your own friends, and you don't have to like everyone. You can sometimes feel confused and ambivalent and not know all the answers. I am very proud of you. Self-fathering and time machine rescue operation. Many abandoned children enter adulthood feeling that the world is a dangerous place, where they are ill-equipped to defend themselves. While self-mothering focuses primarily on healing the wounds of neglect, self-fathering heals the wounds of being helpless to protect yourselves from a parental abuse, and by extension from other abusive authority figures. Self-fathering aims at building assertiveness and self-protection. It includes learning to effectively confront external and/or internal abuse, as well as standing up for adult children's rights, as described in Toolbox 2 of Chapter 16. Many survivors benefit greatly from classes and books on assertiveness training. One of my favorite self-fathering exercises is the Time Machine Rescue Operation. I have used it to help myself and to help clients. With clients, I use it to model a process for fighting off the overwhelming sense of helplessness that often accompanies emotional flashbacks. This is a version of the Time Machine Rescue Operation that I use with myself as well as with my clients. I tell my inner child that if time travel is ever possible, I will travel back into the past and put a stop to my parents' abusiveness. In the course of this, I say things like, I'll call 911. I'll call CPS. I will grab their arm and pin them behind their back for the second they try to strike you. I will muffle them with a gag so they can't scream at you or even mumble their criticisms. I'll put a bag over their heads so they can't frown or glare at you. I'll send them to bed without dessert. I'll do anything you want me to do to protect you. Such imagery often provides me an exit out of fear and shame, and sometimes even makes my inner child laugh in delight. I sometimes finish this exercise by telling my inner child I would also report my parents to the authorities, so they would be sent to counseling to learn how to be a better parent. Or I say that, if I could, I would take him back to live with me in the future, before all those horrible things could happen to him. I remind him that he in fact lives in the present with me now, where I will always do my best to protect him. We now have a powerful body, greater skills of self-protection, and access to allies and a legal system that will protect us. When the recovery consistently welcomes his inner child in every aspect of his being, the child feels increasingly safe and becomes more and more alive and self-expressive. As he experiences his adult self consistently rising to his defense, he will feel safe enough to begin accessing his innate vitality, playfulness, curiosity, and spontaneity. Reparenting by committee. Reparenting at its best is a yin-yang dynamic that balances the mutually enhancing processes of parenting by others and self-reparenting. Reparenting sometimes needs to be initiated and modeled by someone else, such as a therapist, a sponsor, a kind friend, or a supportive group, to show us how to self-reparent ourselves. Alternatively, many survivors instinctively initiate reparenting by others. Via entering one of my clients described as the community of books, they receive reparenting from authors who encourage them to value and support themselves. Alice was such a survivor. Her family traumatized her during childhood so thoroughly that she quickly learned that being vulnerable around others was dangerous, foolish, and totally out of the question. Yet the urge to get support and the help she was so unfairly deprived of worked its way back into her awareness via a strong attraction to self-help books. By reading a great deal of psychology, she eventually found enough help that she began to think that there might be a kind, safe, and helpful person out there in the flesh, and entered into some very helpful therapy. I too went through a long, gradual process of reading and attending lectures before I was able to take the frightening and embarrassing plunge into therapy, where, as stated earlier, I was fortunate enough to find a good enough therapist to take my relational healing to the next level. Therapy allowed me to internalize and mimic my therapist's consistent and reliable stance of being on my side. This in turn led me to gravitate towards safer and more intimate friendships. I have seen this same result with numerous clients and friends. Eventually I achieved my first earned secure attachment outside of therapy and was subsequently ready to let go of therapy as the only place where I could have deep and meaningful connection. I believe the need to have mothering and fathering type support from others is a lifelong need and not just limited to childhood. Unfortunately, I am now blessed many years later to experience a multi-leveled form of reparenting by others, which I call reparenting by committee. I conceptualize reparenting by committee as a circle of friends that has varying layers and levels of intimacy. The inner circle of my reparenting committee includes my 5 closest friends. I think of the inner circle as friends with whom nothing is too vulnerable or taboo to talk about. My wife, a therapist friend, my exercise buddy, and 2 members of long-term men's groups that I was in are in this circle. This circle also has an outer layer of people who would be inner if circumstances allowed me to see them more. Outside this orb are levels of succeeding, less intimate, yet still meaningful circles of relationship. The next circle out is intimates who I rarely see anymore, but who have shared enough intimacy with me in the past I now draw comfort from imagining them caring for me in the present. My deceased grandmother is in this circle, as are 3 of my former therapists. A couple of army buddies, old high school and college friends, and my 4 best friends from the 10 years I lived in Australia. The next circle out from this consists of my nurse practitioner, the body worker I occasionally see, some therapist colleagues, and the wise old school librarian who helped me pick books for my son to read. The next circle out from this are friends I play sports with, parents of my son's friends, and people in my neighborhood with whom my contact is not especially vulnerable, but with whom there is an easy chemistry that adds to my general overall sense of belonging. And the final circle is occasional strangers who from time to time I am graced to have easy and comforting interactions with. I also know various survivors whose effective recovery practices have similarly rewarded them with enough portions of love from a variety of others that their childhood starvation for help and support is significantly assuaged. And like me, their committee started with the first person they had good enough intimacy with. Counting yourself, this is then a committee of 2, which with grace can then build slowly one friendship at a time. The Tao of self-relating and relating to others. Recovering is therefore enhanced on every level by safe human help. Once again, however, survivors with especially harsh betrayal histories may need to do a great deal of work on other levels before they are ready to risk the vulnerability of being open to relational help. Nonetheless, deep level recovering as well as healthy human being is typically a vacillating blend of self-help and help from others. Relational work helps heal the initial wound of family abandonment, and the self-work decreases the self-abandonment that occurs because the child was forced to imitate his parents' abandonment of him. The more time you practice the various techniques of self-care described throughout this book, the less time you spend in self-abandonment. With enough persistence, self-care becomes an invaluable, irreplaceable habit. In advanced recovery, self-help and relational help blend in an important Tao. A Tao is a yin-yang combination of opposites and complementary forces. The Tao of rational recovery involves balancing healthy independence with healthy dependence on others. For the survivor, this therapeutic synthesis can come into being when an improved supportive relationship with yourself allows you to choose and open to a helpful relationship. Sometimes simultaneously, the attainment of a safe, supportive relationship with another person promotes the growth of our ability to be self-supportive. This then rewards you with a decrease in your automatic tendency towards self-abandonment. Complementarily, this then fosters the gradual development of community. The vital life resources that you were so unfairly deprived of in childhood. The more supportive we become, the more we attract supportive others. The more we are supported by others, the more we can support ourselves. Sometimes we get initiated into this dynamic Tao by our own efforts, sometimes by the grace of finding a supportive friend or professional helper. For many of us survivors, a considerable amount of self-help work has to take place before we are able to open to relational support, before we become discerning enough to choose truly safe and helpful support.